and that was the Indo-Australian plate that's now two plates, the Indo plate and the Australian plate, and it cracked in the same earthquake that caused the Banda Aceh tsunami. So such things happen rapidly. And in fact, the more you research this, reading Hapgood and others, the information keeps pointing to all of this stuff occurring on a level of rapidity that is just going to be staggering. Some of these mountain ranges didn't take tens of millions of years to slowly upthrust, did they? No, the idea is basically that as the inner core of the Earth shifts, it causes the cessation of angular momentum in the same direction of the orbit of the Earth, and the equatorial bulge of the Earth flattens out. This causes the Earth to become spherical, which not really, it's an oblate spheroid. It's fatter around the equator than it is around the poles. A key bit of information, too, in all these coatings, by the way. So are most Americans. yes. It's all gone horribly pear-shaped, as the Brits like to say. Yeah. In any event, though, so the inner core flips, and in the process it causes this situation where the equatorial bulge flattens out. Now, that bulge is 26 miles total, or about 13 miles on each side of the planet, composed of seabed and ocean and land. And so when it flattens out, we're able to spin, and we do so in a series of jerky kind of little motions. And it's that really that is both the saving grace and the terror that we have to go through. But because of the way that it does this, the relationship of the continents to each other is not guaranteed to be the same after the event as before. In other words, we won't necessarily sail around all at the same level. Some continents will come to a screeching halt, like, say, India or China, and then India rams into it really fast, and whoops, there's the Himalayas for you. Got it. And the supposition, by the way, is that it's feasible that a mountain range the size of the Himalayas occurred over the course of weeks. It's also the supposition that Lake Titicaca in the Andes Mountains was a seaport, and that it rose up to its current height of over 11,000 feet and did most of that rise in the first 72 hours based on the level of deaths in the local populace at the time and the level of destruction. The major mountain ranges of the world, they generally are north-south. The Rockies, the Cascades, go down to the Andes. They actually have a 60-degree angle that's consistent with that. And I was going to ask you, they're basically north-south, but they are all sort of leaning, if you look at them, one direction or the other, I guess depending on the hemisphere, but maybe not. And that would suggest an angular kind of momentum screeching effect. Yes, and a sudden cessation of it, and things just pile up. Sort of like a slick floor, a carpet with no sticky stuff that you can slide, and then you hit that carpet, and when you hit the wall, it just kind of all scrunches up. Yeah. What do you have in the United States to point to that would suggest that kind of a carpet stack and thrusting a lot of vegetation maybe that's washed off the top into a compressed mass? We have several different things within the continental U.S. that suggest just this. In fact, if you read all of the early literature of the explorers, including into George Washington and so forth, they comment on how much of the landscape at that time, which has now all been changed, showed the signs of great cataclysms. But we have, for instance, on the Appalachians, some of the richest coal fields around, which is basically all of the vegetation from the Rockies across the plains that were just slammed into that particular area, ground up into a fine carnivorous mass and made into coal. What pushed it? Water? Looks that way. That's the supposition that Patrick Garrell has, because here's the idea. Or if we don't have water, just the actual shifting of the crust could cause that too. Not that distance, it's thought. That's a long haul, okay. There's long run-out slides where it's just merely a slide effect that occurs, and they've measured some of these in Canada. And they go considerable distances, but they don't go hundreds of miles. They might go 30 miles at the most. Okay. So, no, it looks as though it was a water effect. The issue, too, is that the badlands here in the U.S. have been scrubbed out by water in the eastern half of the Washington State and Oregon. You also show effects of large water runoff causing land sculpting effects and so on. So something caused that. We can postulate any number of things, but it now becomes evident that within this particular kind of a theory of a recurring cataclysm that involves this particular kind of emotion, this would be expected routinely. And basically what happens is, as the equatorial bulge shifts, 13 miles of water gets displaced and has to go somewhere. And so it sort of starts trying to crawl up out of the ocean beds over the continents just as they get filled up. And so rises to some considerable height, and then as the planet is attempting to reestablish its spin, bear in mind there's this fundamental law called the law of the conservation of angular momentum, and you can basically it's exhibited every time anybody throws a baseball. The speed at which it leaves your hand is due to the angular momentum of the arc of the pitcher's arm, and so it's that arc that creates that level of speed, and that's what we're going to encounter here. And as that angular momentum attempts to reassert itself, the oceans slosh around a bit and go walkabout over the continent.
Slosh a bit? Okay. How big of a bit are you talking about?
There's the rub. Okay, this is something that is unknown. There's a great deal of, and I'm not through my research on it yet, so I haven't really formed serious conclusions on it, but I was educated as an oceanographer in the physical components of oceanography, and I'm familiar with waveforms and all this kind of stuff. And I would dispute that the idea that you could get a 1.5 mile high level of water under the conditions that Gerald states that may be possible, but even his work notes that the ancient history of all of this, from the people that used to be Atlanteans that ended up becoming the Egyptians, they wrote about it, as well as the Hindus. And there's another thing that reinforces my opinion of Gerald. He never got into the Hindu myths or the Taoist or any of that, and that's my area of expertise. I've been reading that stuff for years, decades.
And so that dovetails.
That dovetails, exactly. I mean, just to the same level of precision on the numbers, they're encoded in there in the whole deal.
Well, if water, I don't mean to jump all over this, but if water were sloshing and surging over most of the land masses, half a mile, whatever, they would obviously scrub clean the surface of nuclear power plants, 103 here in this country and all the rest. Wouldn't it tend to turn the oceans when they resided back from whence they came into rather ugly soup for a while?
There's probably going to be that, but then there's also other issues. Maybe long before that, that is to say maybe months before that, devastating earthquakes may make all the nuke plants melt down. And we may find ourselves in a horrid nuclear environment long before this occurs.
Sure.
There's a whole lot of predictable precursors that should exist if this theory is correct, and we're actually seeing some of those precursors now.
What you described of South America, or rather South Africa, is very interesting. I didn't know that. It's a huge trench.
Yes. Actually, in northern Africa near Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a whole new ocean that's being formed, and they know that Africa is splitting. Well, again, part of the effect of all of this has got to be that it's a predictable level of impact is not only things like the level of fertility going down, but a level of chaos, for instance, must exist within the magnetic structure of each and every one of the planets that can exhibit itself in a number of different ways, some of which will be extremely deep earthquakes, alterations in tectonic plates as the inner core of the Earth gets magnetically twisted all around, very similar to the Sun.
Very interesting. All right, back in a couple of minutes to talk more about this with Cliff. Glad you're along tonight. Not sure if you are, but we're glad to have you. Right back. Let's get right back to our conversation with Cliff. You know, when we talk about the seed bank, we talk about Google digitizing books, and the one question which has always bothered me, although I think I've got a fairly good idea why, the continuing rape and degradation and destruction of our home, our planet. Why? Not one international globalist corporation, not one major government on the world is making any serious effort to reverse the looting, the destruction of our home. Not happening.
It does not make any sense.
No,
we have not organized ourselves appropriately.
No, why kill the golden goose?
Right.
Okay. Does this suggest that at some level, not all CEOs, not all somebody knows somewhere that this something very big and very unpleasant is going to happen. So what the hell difference does it matter? That's what they're saying. I don't know. Now, the other issue is Denver, right in the center, 2.5 hours either way from coast to coast, something like that. DIA is supposedly linked to underground transport that probably goes under the Rockies. And there is a lot of talk, has been for many, many years, about a very large underground safe dwelling for special folk who could fly in within 2.5 hours, go into an underground transport at the airport, and be, shall we say, secure? I don't know. You got 1.5 miles of water running over you. You got mountain ranges displaced. Who knows? I don't have the answers. Even if it's localized 400-yard tsunamis running over 100 square miles, it doesn't matter. It's not going to be that simple. But isn't it 90% of the world's populace, Cliff, lives on the coast or very close to the ocean?
Yeah, within 30 miles, you get 85% of